We're starting a brand new series today, so if you're new to Aspire or you're just coming, this is a great week to jump in because we're kicking off a new series that we're calling Grasping for God. Now, this series is kind of a continuation of a series we did last summer when we started looking at the life of Abraham, and we're going to spend last summer, this summer, and next summer looking at what the Bible calls the patriarchs. Now, if you don't know what the patriarchs are, if you've ever heard anybody talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's a phrase that gets repeated in the Bible a lot, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are those patriarchs. That when God began his redemptive work in the world, he picked one man, a flawed, imperfect person named Abraham, and he started working through him. And he said, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your family, and your family is going to grow, and it's going to become a nation, and through that nation, I'm going to bless the whole world. And of course, we know that Jesus came out of that same family line. Jesus came out of that nation. And so this story of Abraham that we looked at last summer, we're going to continue this summer as we look at his grandson, a man named Jacob. Now, if you were listening, you're probably already thinking, wait a minute, you skipped one. Because you talked about the grandfather, Abraham. You're talking about the grandson, Jacob. What about Isaac in the middle? Well, we're going to cover Isaac. We covered him a little bit last summer. We're going to cover him a little bit this summer. But the way the story of Genesis breaks down is there are 14 chapters about Abraham. There are 11 chapters about Jacob. There are 13 chapters about Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph. And Isaac only gets 3.5 chapters. He doesn't have a lot. We don't have a lot of story about him. So we looked at him a little bit last summer. We're going to look at him this morning as we kick off the story about Jacob. And we're going to look at him in a particular chapter, chapter 26. If you have a Bible, go and open to Genesis 26. It's a little bit of an odd chapter. It's not one that you may have heard a lot of sermons on. I've never preached from it before. In fact, I've never heard a sermon from Genesis before. But Isaac's story tells us something so important and so relevant for us today. Because Isaac's story talks to us about generational patterns. Now, some of you may know what I'm talking about when I say that, but for those of you who don't know, there are patterns that sort of follow through generations and families. Some of you who might be football fans of a particular football team are fans of that team because your father and his father were fans of that football team, right? If you're in the SEC, you are born to be a fan of Georgia or Florida or Alabama or somebody, right? I mean, some of that's just inherited. Some of that, now we always have stray children who go off to a different school and become fans of a different school. You know, there's grace for that, but those things are inherited. Sometimes it's what college you go to or what school you went to. My parents went to this school, their parents went to this school, and so I went to that same school. Sometimes it may be something as simple as recipes, family recipes and traditions that get passed down from generation to generation. All of those kind of things happen. Those are kind of easy to see, but what's not always so easy to see is some of the brokenness in our lives. That there are habits that we have, good and bad habits, that we just pick up from our parents and from our grandparents, and they picked them up probably from their parents and grandparents. There are family systems and family cycles in place. One of the things, when we talk about sin, one of the things that we fail to often discuss is that sin is not just something that I do that is in violation of God's law. Sin is also something I inherit. Like I get it. There's ways in which my parents sinned and I just grew up living in those same patterns and those same examples. You may have some examples of that as well. Now, it's not just sin. It's also faith. Some of you grew up in a Baptist church and you are still a Baptist and your grandparents were Baptist, some of you Methodist or Catholic or whatever. There were that were handed on as well. There were ways and beliefs you had about the Bible that your parents may have given you if you grew up in a Christian home. There may have been things that they handed down to you. Even if your parents weren't religious, they weren't believers, they may have had ideas about God that you inherited and you continued to believe those things until maybe you were presented with some alternative facts. So we inherit all kinds of things from our family. And Isaac, the story of Isaac, is a story about some of these family systems and family patterns. And so what we're going to look at today is how we can break destructive generational patterns and find a personal relationship with the God of our fathers that is our own. It's not just a religion we inherit, but it's something that is ours. So when we look at Genesis 26, I want to break it down into 3 parts. I think the first thing it tells us is something to avoid. The second thing is something that we must discover or something we must find. And finally, something to do. So let's start with something to avoid, something to avoid. And the thing that we're trying to avoid are the sins of our father. Look with me at verse 1 of chapter 26 in Genesis. Now, there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. Now, that's an important note because this story is going to be a little bit of a repeat of something that already happened. And the writer of Genesis wants you to know this is a different famine. There's another famine that has come besides the previous one in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all of this land and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham." Now, why this is important is because this is a speech that God made to Isaac's father Abraham many, many years ago. He told him that he was going to bless him. And so now God is repeating the promise to Abraham's son Isaac. And he goes on, he says, "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all of these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commandments, my decrees, and my instructions." So, there's a famine. When there was a famine before, there was a particular famine, and Abraham took Sarah and fled from the famine and went down to Egypt. And God is saying to Isaac, don't do that. There's a famine, but I want you to stay right where you are. And I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your descendants as many as the stars in the sky, and I'm going to bless all the world because of you. And listen to what Isaac does in response. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. So far, so good. He did what God told him to do. He stayed put. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought, the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. So Isaac just makes up a story. "She's not my wife, she's my sister." Now, never mind, he is putting Rebekah at great danger right now. So listen to what happens. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. Ha ha ha. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" So Abimelech is looking out and he catches the two of them together and he's like, "Sister and brother don't act that way. She is not your sister. She is your wife." Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Now, this is a strange story, right? I mean, this is just a little weird. It's even more strange when you realize this story has been repeated before. If it sounded familiar to you, it's because it is familiar. In Genesis chapter 2, when Abraham went down to Egypt with Sarah, he did exactly the same thing. He told Pharaoh, "Oh, this is not my wife, this is my sister." And then Pharaoh found out that it was really his wife. And then some years later, when Abraham was again in the same area where Isaac is now in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham does the same thing to this same king, Abimelech. That he says, "Oh, Sarah, make sure you tell everybody you're my sister, not my wife." And so now we see this pattern that Abraham, this thing that Abraham has done twice, is now being repeated in Isaac's life. It's like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. We just keep living the same thing over and over again. But isn't that what sin does? Like, you see the mistakes of people who've gone before you. You might even think when you're a kid, "I'll never do that." And then you find yourself one day waking up and realize you've done exactly the same thing that you said you would never do, and you're getting exactly the same results that they got when they did it. See, there's a pattern that comes with sin and with families. And the writer of Genesis wants you to know this is a pattern. This is the consequence of generational sin. Now, you might be thinking so far, but wait a minute. What is the sin? What sin did Isaac commit? Weren't Abraham and Isaac just being cautious? Weren't they being careful? But you see this pattern that's established by Abraham and continues by Isaac. What it shows is that they had fear. That fear was being passed down from one generation to another. That there was a lack of trust in God. Remember what God said to Isaac in verses 2-5. When he appeared to him and he said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you the father of a great nation. He hears all of God's promises and then he immediately gives into fear. And he repeats Abraham's exact God's promise directly. He defaults to fear, and we do the same thing. This is a picture of sinful patterns that can be passed down from one generation to the next, especially when fear replaces faith. When you are in a difficult situation and you are facing fear, you will default to the patterns that have been handed down to you. Now, that doesn't make it your parents' fault. It doesn't make it your grandparents' fault. We are all responsible for our own sin. But it is true that those patterns will repeat themselves when we face a difficult time. Now, it's easy to identify this in these stories. The writer of Genesis makes it pretty obvious. It's much more difficult to see in our own families. I think about this with my own family, and I was thinking about it in several ways, in several patterns, and maybe your family has some similar experiences. But I heard the stories of my great-grandparents who were married, and they had a son, and my grandfather was a little bit older and went off to World War II, and my grandparents divorced right before he went off to war. My grandfather ended up being kind of passed around to other families for a long time throughout his childhood and into his teenage years and early adulthood. Now, his parents, my great-grandparents, eventually remarried, but my grandfather sort of lived with the consequences of their divorce. Well, within just a few decades, my grandfather, who was married to my grandmother, they had 6 kids. My grandfather left my grandmother and the 6 kids. My grandmother had never worked a day in her life. She didn't even have a driver's license, didn't know how to drive. And that family fell apart. And then in my mom and with her siblings, the divorce has been rampant among her and her siblings. And then when I look at down into my cousin's generation, there's been a lot of divorce. Now, I'm not saying all of this is the fault of my great-grandparents. It's not true. But it is true, if you look at the statistics, the children of divorced parents are much more likely to be divorced. I think about it when it comes to alcohol. I can track back in my family on both generations, back several generations, and I can find people who struggled with drug and alcohol abuse. And it passed down from one generation to the next. And it is true that the child of an alcoholic is much more likely to become an alcoholic. There are patterns and cycles that come into play. It's been true in the time of Abraham and Isaac. It's true in our day today. The problem is we don't often know what those patterns are. We don't recognize them. We don't see them for what they are. And here's the trouble with that. You can't heal what you won't name, and what you won't name, you'll pass on. You can't heal what you won't name, and what you won't name, you will pass on to the next generation. And so what we have to do is by faith, we have to recognize the patterns. We have to avoid falling into the trap of the silence. And we have to ask God to help us break the power of canceled sin. We sing that at Christmas time, that Jesus breaks the power of canceled sin. What does that even mean? Well, Jesus canceled the power of all sin on the cross. He canceled sin on the cross. But the effects of sin repeat in generations. And that power is broken when we give up fear and instead embrace faith. So we have to recognize the pattern. We have to invite God into those patterns. We talk about confessing our sin, but we need to also do a deeper dive into the sins that are generational and recognize what's going on. What cycles exist in your family? Maybe they're relational. Maybe there's a pattern in your family of relational problems between husbands and wives, or between fathers and sons, or mothers and daughters. Maybe it's emotional. Maybe it's spiritual. Do you see any of those repeating in your life? And it doesn't have to be something dramatic. It can be something like dishonesty. Grandma used to tell little white lies, and mom told little white lies, and so I tell little white lies. I mean, it might not be something very big. It could be something simple. It could be an addiction. It could be passivity. Grandpa sort of kept his hands off the family, didn't get too involved, and dad didn't really get too involved in the family, and so, you know what, I'm just going to let the women take care of it. And passivity gets passed down from one generation to the next. Maybe it's legalism. Whatever runs in your spiritual family tree has the potential to be a default sin in your life if you don't recognize the pattern and if you don't embrace by faith the opportunity that God has given you to overcome those patterns. And what fear is underneath those patterns? And how can you break it? By trusting in Christ. See, this is the story that you were given, but it doesn't have to be the story you share. It doesn't have to be a story you pass on to your kids. You can ask God to help you craft a new one. Sin runs in families, but so does grace. And grace breaks the cycle. So there's something to avoid, and that is the sins of our father, but there's also something to discover, and that is the wells of my father. Look what happens next in verse 12 and following. So Isaac planted crops in that land. The same year reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. In other words, remember God said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you, Isaac, just trust me. And here, God is fulfilling the promise. He's blessing him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Now, pick up what's going on here. God is blessing Isaac so much that the locals are getting jealous. They're kind of angry with him. And so what do they do in response? They go around and they fill in all the wells that his father Abraham had dug. Now, wells in this day and age represented not just the opportunity to get water in the desert in an arid place, which is where they were living, but they represented life. It represented supply. It represented stability. Owning a well meant you had a secure future. And Abraham's wells were dug, not just for water, but they had become symbols of God's faithful promises to him, that God had kept them. So when the Philistines are going around filling in the wells, they weren't just trying to remove the infrastructure of the water. They were trying to erase Abraham's identity and his legacy. They had tried to erase him out of it. So look what happens next in verse 16. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names that his father had given them. So Isaac is going around reopening his dad's wells. Now this is physically, right? He's physically reopening them, but this is also symbolic, because he is retracing his father's faith. But reopening the wells is only the start. He gives the wells the same names his father had given them. He's reclaiming the promises of God. Yet this inherited foundation is going to be tested. This faith that he is getting from his father is going to be tested because he's in conflict with all of the people around him. Isaac reopens his father's wells. It's more than just survival. It is a spiritual revival and renewal. He's reclaiming the promises. He's reclaiming the legacy. He's reclaiming reliance on God himself. He is looking into his father's faith and realizing the same God that blessed his father is the same God who has promised to bless him, is the same God who is keeping his promises. See, we not only inherit a tendency towards certain sins, but we also inherit faith from those who've gone before us. And our faith journey often begins by reopening the wells of those who've gone before us. And for you, you say, well, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. Nobody in my family were Christian. I'm the first Christian in my family. But there were still spiritual forefathers who went before you, mothers who went before you, who paved the way. Maybe it was somebody who shared the gospel with you. Maybe it was somebody who taught you in Sunday school. And they have paved the way for you. They dug wells, and you have benefited from the refreshing water in those wells. And one of the things that we have to do to connect with God is understand that we have to tap into the wells of those who've gone before us. As believers and followers of Jesus, we stand in a great cloud of witnesses who've gone before us. 2,000 years of church history of people who've gone before us. The reason we have a Bible today, that we can even pull stories from the Bible that inspire us and challenge us, is because there were men and women who preserved and translated and passed on and taught the Scripture. And so today we sit here and we drink from the wells of our fathers. What are you doing? What are you doing to reopen the wells of those who've gone before you? Are you spending time in God's Word? Are you praying? Are you investing in community? Are you being generous with your time, your talent, your treasure? See, Isaac didn't just stop when he reopened the wells of his father. He's about to dig new ones himself. It's a symbolic act of embracing a faith that wasn't just inherited, but that is personal and that's living. Faith begins when we reopen the wells of those who've gone before, but faith is only sustained when we dig our own wells. Legacy matters, but it's not enough. Every generation must decide for themselves, will we repeat the sins of our past? Will we just rely on the religion that we inherited? Or will we discover a living faith of our own? Which leads us to the end of Genesis 26. And this is where we find something to do. Discover new wells of living water. Look what it says with me beginning in verse 19 and following. So Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it, and he named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid." Here it is. He's repeating it. Now remember, he first appeared to Isaac at the beginning of the story. He told him not to fear. Don't be afraid. I'm going to bless you. Isaac was afraid. He repeated the sins of his father. Isaac has since gone and reopened the wells of his father, and then he has dug new ones of his own, and then God appears to him, and he reminds him, "Do not be afraid. I am with you. I will bless you. I will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and it's the first time we have record of Isaac calling on the name of the Lord himself. There he pitched his tent, and there his servant dug a well. So after he opened old wells, Isaac dug new ones. He named the last one Rehoboth, which means room, because he had struggled. The first well he dug, the locals wanted it. They said, "That's our water." So he dug another one, and they took that one from him. And finally, he found a third one. He builds this third one, and God appears to him. And then Isaac builds this altar, and God meets him again. See, what has happened here is that Isaac is no longer living on a secondhand faith. This is his faith. This is his altar. These are the wells that he has dug. See, faith is maintained not only through inheritance, but also through ongoing obedience and fresh and new encounters with God. When we are determined to dig wells and have a relationship with God that's personal, we will face opposition, just like Isaac did. Some of you are there right now. Some of you are saying, I'm really trying. I knew I needed to get back to my faith. I needed to get back to the Bible. I need to get back to church. I need to get back to community. But every time I do it, it feels like there's an opposition. I'm finding opposition. And some of you may have even at some point given up on that. Notice that Isaac didn't give up digging new wells. He kept digging and digging and digging until finally there was a well that he said, finally, there's room. And it was only when he found that place, when he persevered, that God appeared to him and he received the blessing and God built the altar. Keep digging. Don't settle for nostalgia. Don't settle for the religion of your parents, the wells your parents dug. Seek a personal encounter with the living God. I love the way Tim Keller puts it. He said, faith must be owned, not inherited. You can inherit religion, but you must choose faith. I love that. You can inherit religion, but you must choose faith. And they're not the same thing. Not that religion is bad. Religion may point you to a real faith in Jesus Christ. But you can inherit the religion, but you cannot inherit the faith. You must dig the wells for yourself. Which brings us to the big point that I want to make to you today from Genesis 26. Sin is generational. Religion can be inherited. But only Jesus offers living water of salvation. Sin is generational. The patterns that existed before you are patterns that you are likely to fall into. Religion can be inherited. Your mom and your dad's religion is something that you might have known about and might have even practiced yourself, but only Jesus offers the living water of salvation. You think, now wait a minute. Jesus isn't even in this story, right? Where was Jesus in this story? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because see, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the beginning of the story. The fulfillment of that, hundreds and hundreds of years later, after God has kept all of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is this great nation, and out of that nation, in the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would come Jesus. And Jesus had a very interesting encounter at a well, and it wasn't just any well. John chapter 4 tells us a story where Jesus encountered a Samaritan woman at a well. And the well is the well of Jacob. Now remember, Abraham dug wells. Isaac reopened those wells and dug his own. That is going to continue with Isaac's son Jacob. Jacob dug wells, and one of the wells that Jacob dug was still in use in the time of Jesus. And so Jesus is out by this well. He's sitting by this well. His disciples have gone back into town to get some money. And as Jesus is sitting by this well in the middle of the day, the hottest part of the day, a woman comes to the well all by herself, which already tells us that something was wrong. Because in this day and age, in this culture, women would have gone to the wells together in the morning before it was hot. It was kind of a social event. They would all get their buckets and their cisterns. They'd go to the well together. They'd fill the well, their cisterns and buckets for the day, and then they'd take them home. But this woman is coming in the heat of the day, meaning that she's an outcast. So as she's coming to the well, Jesus is there, and he asks the woman for a drink. And the woman is shocked. Because first of all, men didn't talk to women in this culture like that. And Jews didn't talk to Samaritans. And so she's like, I can't believe you, a Jew, would ask me for water. And Jesus says something to her that's really interesting. He said, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me, and I'd give you living water, and you'd never be thirsty again. And the woman scoffs. She's like, man, you need to give me some of that water, because I am tired of coming to this well every day. And then they get into this conversation. And what you see in this woman are the two things that we've already talked about. You see in her generational sin and brokenness that has continued on, and you see an inherited religion. So as Jesus is talking to her, what you find out is this woman has been married 5 times, and now she's living with a man who is not her husband. This is why she's been an outcast. This is why she's going to the well by herself. This generational sin has affected her life, and it has ostracized her from the rest of her community. But then she enters into this religious conversation. And she says, oh, you Jews worship on that hill and we worship on this hill. And Jesus says, this isn't about religion. This isn't about the religion you inherited from your father. And Jesus says to her this in John chapter 4, verse 13 and 14, talking about this well that Jacob dug, that had been in use for hundreds of years at that point. He says, everyone who drinks of this well will be thirsty again. See, if you are trying to live off the religion of your parents or grandparents, you are just going to get thirsty again and again and again. And Jesus is telling her, everybody who drinks from this well will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give them will never be thirsty again. See, Jesus doesn't just fill our old wells of religion. Jesus is the living water itself. And so we have to be aware of the patterns of generational sin. We have to break the silence. We have to confess those sins to God and ask him to break the power of canceled sin. We have to recognize those who've gone before us in faith and learn what we can from them. But we have to discover and dig wells for ourselves in Jesus Christ. So there are 3 things I want you to take away today. And the first one will not be a surprise at all. Avoid sin. Right? Like, what would you expect me to say? Anything besides that, right? Avoid sin. Except this. I'm convinced that some of the most dangerous sins are the most subtle sins that we never see and recognize. Because they're sins that are so normal to us because they've been normalized by our culture, they've been normalized by our family, that we don't even see them as that. And that we have to pray and ask God to open our eyes to see those patterns. For Isaac, he probably wasn't even conscious of the fact of what his dad had done to his mother 2 times and he was then doing to his own wife. What are those patterns? How can we avoid that generational sin? The second thing is to embrace a legacy of faith. That there's been a faith that has been passed down to us, the message of the gospel that has been handed down from one generation to the next. And we have to embrace that legacy of faith, but most importantly, we have to pursue a living faith of our own, a faith that's only found in Jesus Christ. And so today, I want to just extend this offer to you. As we are beginning this story, we'll get into Jacob's life next week, but as we take this opportunity to talk about Isaac and to talk about this generational sin and the faith of our fathers and the need that we have for our own faith in Jesus, I just want to extend that invitation to you who are here today. Our musicians are going to come and we're going to sing one final song. Maybe today you realize as you're here that you have been living in the patterns of the brokenness of your family. And you thought this is just the way it is. This is just how we live. But maybe today the Holy Spirit's whispering to you and saying, no, you don't have to live that way. You can break the silence. You can break the pattern. It can be different for your kids and your grandkids. You will never do that on your own. You don't have the strength and the power to do that on your own, but Jesus can do that for you. Maybe today you're here and you said, I've been living on the religion of my parents, but I've never made it my own. I've never myself taken a drink from the wells of living water. So today, the invitation is for you, for all those who are thirsty to come and to drink in Jesus, the living water, that you will never be thirsty again. Not because you're living on the wells of your fathers, not because you're living in the patterns of broken sin, but because Jesus is extending to all of us streams of living water.